Good day, ladies and gentlemen. I'm back with my good friend Matt Gaspers from Catholic Family News. We're going to talk about the Bishop Viganò situation, which I'm sure you've heard of, unless you've been living under a rock, which would be kind of nice sometimes. But we're going to do a deep dive. You know, when we bring Matt on here, when Matt goes on any show, he brings the receipts. And he sent me, it looks like you sent me almost something like enough information for 2 or 3 articles in the emails you sent with all the research. So we're going to get deep into this stuff. So Matt, thanks for coming on today.
Well, thanks for having me, Kennedy. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you. So ladies and gentlemen, I want to give you a little background of basically the plan of this show. So we're going to go over just the background of what's actually going on as far as what he's been charged with. And then we're going to take a look at Bishop Viganò's statements in response to that, but then also over the years, because we think it's fair to any man, if he's going to be accused of something or charged with something, and, he said, let's say, inflammatory things, these things should be understood in how he's always used these words. There's been a lot of comparisons between Archbishop Viganò and Archbishop Lefebvre, and of course, there are definitely similarities in a sense, but then there are differences. Doesn't mean necessarily that it's wrong what Bishop Viganò has done, because everyone's going to react differently in different circumstances. But it's just important that we get it right, and I think that's what's most important here. I did a video the other day, and Matt and I were talking about this before we came on. I'm sympathetic. I understand that I really don't have it in my heart to call Bishop Viganò a schismatic based on all the considerations. I've said this before, that even though I don't agree with sedevacantism, I have a hard time saying a sedevacantist is necessarily a sedevacantist for coming to, or is necessarily a schismatic for that conclusion. So I'm kind of more open-minded to, even though I don't believe it, I'm just more open-minded to considering the state of the person, because we're supposed to do that in these legal activities, is understand the mens rea and the actus rea in the legal sense, the mind and the actions, do they fit? It's just like the theology of mortal sin. You've got to have an intention and a will behind it and all these sorts of things. So we're going to get into that. So, Matt, where should we begin?
Well, I suppose we can just begin with the charges that have been leveled against Archbishop Viganò. Technically, it's a single charge. The charge is schism, but it kind of has 3 prongs or 3 aspects to it. So the official decree identifies the following 3 things as being in the charge of schism. So number 1, a denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis. Number 2, rupture of communion with him, and I'm quoting directly from the decree right now. And then number 3, rejection of the Second Vatican Council.
Mm-hmm.
And these are all things which the decree says is necessary to be in full communion with the Catholic Church. And obviously the terminology of full communion is in itself problematic.
Yeah.
But that's how it is in the current code of canon law. So here we are.
So let's just break down a couple of those terms though first. So
Sure.
this idea of the rejection of the Second Vatican Council. To your mind, does Bishop Viganò reject that it was a council of the church that was called and was closed? Or are they saying because he doesn't take there is no official interpretation because they're always changing it. So, but the fact that he doesn't sort of just give the blind external compliance to what he's supposed to think about it, does that constitute, do you think, in their minds, rejection of the council per se?
I think in their minds, in the minds of those at the dicastery, like Cardinal Fernandez and probably Pope Francis and others, I'm sure in their minds it does constitute a rejection of the council. Whether it does in reality is debatable.
Yeah,
Because, and we'll get into that when we look at some of his
sure.
prior statements, but he does, in the past anyway, he has publicly acknowledged that it is a valid ecumenical council. He just has issues, as do others like Bishop Athanasius Snyder, for example, who's also made his concerns and his objections public in writing, and
Mm-hmm.
he's not having this charge leveled against him. So it's kind of an interesting case in that sense.
Yeah, and we should remind people that these things started to take off after he had accused Pope Francis of being involved in abuse. And we don't have
Yeah.
proof of that, obviously, from Viganò, and we're waiting to see if there is any. But it does seem like there may be a political motivation behind this, because it started to happen pretty swiftly after that.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So maybe we can now go to some of Viganò's response. So all of this news broke, as folks may remember, last Thursday. Looking at my calendar, make sure I got that right. Yes, Thursday, June 20th. That was the day that, according to the decree that Archbishop Viganò made, he circulated through email to some folks. I was a recipient. My superior at Catholic Family News was also a recipient, Brian McCall, and I'm sure many others. We were like blind copied, so I don't know who all it went to. Um, so he also put it on his Twitter page, his response to the charges. And I have a couple of quotes to read to give us an idea, kind of a sampling from that document. He says, I regard the accusations against me as an honor. I believe that the very wording of the charges confirms the theses that I have repeatedly defended in my various addresses, which we'll get to in this show. It is no coincidence that the accusation against me concerns the questioning of the legitimacy of Jorge Mario Bergoglio and, in italics, the rejection of Vatican II. The council, he says, represents the ideological, theological, moral, and liturgical cancer of which the Bergoglian synodal church, in quotes, is the necessary metastasis. He goes on to say, in the face of the dicastery's accusations, I claim, as successor of the apostles, to be in full communion with the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church, with the magisterium of the Roman pontiffs, and with the uninterrupted doctrinal, moral, and liturgical tradition which they have faithfully preserved. I repudiate the neo-modernist errors inherent in the Second Vatican Council and in the so-called post-conciliar magisterium, again in quotes, in particular in matters of collegiality, ecumenism, religious freedom, the secularity of the state, and the liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
He also talks about repudiating, rejecting, condemning the scandals, errors, and heresies of Jorge Mario Bergoglio. And ultimately, he says, no Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this Bergoglian church
Mm-hmm.
because it acts in a clear discontinuity and rupture with all the popes of history and with the Church of Christ. So here I think we need to pause and think about what does he mean when he says Bergoglian church, because he also uses language conciliar church. He's also talked about a parallel church in one of his first interventions,
Yep.
anti-church, deep church. He uses all these different phrases, basically meaning the cadre of modernist infiltrators who are like a cancer within the mystical body of Christ and are subverting it from within. That's how I understand it.
Yeah, yeah, and we also have to do a little bit of a trip through church history. I was talking to Bishop Schneider a couple of days ago, not about Bishop Viganò. It was an interview for a book he has coming out in the next 3 weeks or so. I'll post it when the book's out. And the topic of Archbishop Lefebvre came up, and Bishop Schneider, as he does, he defends the Archbishop, and he brought up how in the first, during the Arian crisis, that they have the writings of Saint Hilary of Poitiers and so forth, where Athanasius was commanded to make peace essentially with the Arian bishops, who were legitimately the bishops in the legal sense. And he was given this commandment by the Pope, and he chose not to. And he said, "I will not have," I'm paraphrasing, but I will not have communion with these heretics. Now, he was excommunicated or exiled. Those terms are used interchangeably in the past, but he was told to get out of the area and leave because you're being a bad boy. And, history remembers St. Athanasius as a hero, and it remembers those Arians as heretics. Now, this is not to compare one-to-one Viganò to Athanasius, but it is to say that when there is legitimate heresy in the church, and there is right now, there
I
are
agree.
many,
Yes.
many, many heretics that are legitimate heretics. I did a show on this the other day. I always recommend that book, Ultramontanism and Tradition, which you're featured in that book as well. And John Lamont has an essay in there where he goes through John Lamont is not a scholar that you approach with kid gloves, and he brings receipts, and he shows that, when you can establish somebody's a heretic without a trial, it's not necessary. It never has been necessary. The warnings and things like that from officials in the church are a way of warning the person that they are a heretic. But if somebody is the Pope or a bishop and already has scholastic training and theological training and so forth, I mean, he knows he knows the doctrines he's
He
rejecting,
certainly should anyway.
and you have every reason to believe that he does. And the scriptures tell us to shun a man who is a heretic and not have anything to do with him. And these are the facts, ladies and gentlemen, that are difficult to deal with. And we find ourselves in a situation in the church right now, which is very mysterious. It's very mysterious. It's happening. We don't know how it's happening. No one has the simple answer, and Bishop Viganò has an answer, and some believe it's schismatic and some don't. I'm just putting this historical information out there for people to give it sort of the broad view.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I know for myself, when I first started learning about all of this was in the early 2000s, and the analogy that I've used before, it did feel a lot like being unplugged from the matrix. It's kind of a cliche now, but
Yeah.
that really is how it is, because the average pew sitting Catholic in the diocesan setting has no idea about the gravity and the depth of the crisis in the church. They're just kind of going to mass and going through the motions, and oh, great, Dr. Marshall,
Taylor's there. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
awesome.
Yeah, you're right. It's yeah.
So it is so, like, to really become awake to all of this stuff is very uncomfortable.
Mhm.
Even certainly at first, but even continuing forward, it's not a comfortable place to be, but it's the truth. So
It is the truth. Thank you. Dick Rivy's here as well, Mr. Nugent from Ireland. I'll be in Ireland. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, I haven't mentioned this. I'm going to be in Ireland at the end of August for the Ireland SSPX conference. So if you're there, I mean, you can drive
yes.
anywhere in Ireland in about 2.5, 3 hours. So you're not that far away. So check out the information there at the SSPX Ireland. But yeah, right now, Matt, I'm in a position now as a Catholic, where as long as somebody is not embracing some sort of legitimate heresy, I've been going after the charismatics recently, but that's because I think there are massive doctrinal and spiritual errors. But as far as these matters of governance, these matters of what to do, I mean, goodness gracious, I mean, you're faced with the situation. For example, if your traditional Latin Mass is going to be banned, that is going to cause another whole huge headache for people that don't have access to the society and things like that, and even people who do have access to the society. I can tell you, as somebody who brought my family over to the SSPX, that it was filled with a lot of turmoil in our personal life of people who we were friends with for years as Catholics, who basically acted as if we didn't exist anymore because we were now schismatics. So there's no easy way through what's going on right now. And if you are someone who is reading a lot of stuff and watching and listening to a lot of stuff, and you become convinced that there is some sort of impassable impasse happening right now, where you believe that Pope Francis is an anti-pope or something like that, you're not crazy if you think that. That's just kind of my mentality right now, and I just want to make sure that I hammer that home, because tempers have been flaring about this Viganò thing, and I just want people to take the 30,000-foot view and look at it as a reaction in a time where it doesn't really seem there is the right reaction. Because if you go along with everything, that's not going to work. So what do you go along with? What do you reject, and so forth? And how do you remain Catholic doing so? I don't have the answer to that. So anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, as Sister Lucia of the Fatima Visionary put it so well in some of her letters back in the 70s, we're experiencing a diabolical disorientation. That's what this is. That's the perfect phrase.
Can we point out something as well, Matt, which I think is so funny about this whole thing, is that Pope Francis is on record on airplane interviews and things like that, basically saying Lutherans have the same view of justification as Catholics. I mean, these people don't actually believe in schism. They don't actually believe, because they don't believe in an ecclesiology that is traditional. Even
Right.
Ratzinger, in Theological Highlights of Vatican II back in the 1960s, he thought it was a victory of the council that they rejected the strongly anti-modernist position, the Bellarminian position, he called it, of what it meant to belong to the church. Unity of faith, unity of sacraments, unity of governance. And they thought that was too narrow and restrictive. So I don't even know how they're calling Bishop Viganò a schismatic, because I don't even think they believe in schism, because I don't think they believe there's no salvation outside the Catholic Church. So there's just so many layers of this where it's just so perplexing.
Right. Indeed. So getting back to Viganò's response, I'll just read the
Sure.
line that I left off with. He says, "No Catholic worthy of the name can be in communion with this, what he calls Bergoglian church,
Yeah.
in quotes, because it acts in clear discontinuity and rupture with all the popes of history and with the Church of Christ. So what does he mean by this term Bergoglian church?
Mhm.
I have two quotes to share from his previous writings. And before I do that, I just want to give a shout out to my superior at Catholic Family News, Professor Brian McCall.
Mhm.
He is the editor of this book from Angelico Press, which is a compilation of the writings of Archbishop Viganò beginning. Why are you two so schismatic? uh, got Taylor Marshall trolling us in the chat. That's awesome. So this book is a compilation. As you can see, it's pretty substantial in size. Sorry,
Yep.
but it's available from Angelico Press. And the writings include um, starting with his original testimony in August of 2018 and going through January of 2021 when he gave an interview to Steve Bannon. So it covers a lot of ground.
There's a book there,
Yeah,
ladies and
there it
gentlemen.
is.
You can find
There
that
it
on
is.
Amazon. Anyway, yeah, so go check it out.
So that's where I'm getting, this is kind of the definitive anthology of from that time period of Archbishop Viganò's text, because Professor McCall worked with Archbishop Viganò directly in putting this together.
Okay.
But some of these interventions are also available. Like we've published a lot of them as Archbishop Viganò was releasing them on the Catholic Family News website. But the book is kind of the definitive anthology. So here's the first quote. This is from what Brian calls in the book First Letter on Vatican II, responding to Bishop Schneider. This was released or dated June 9th, 2020. And this is like the first major bombshell where Archbishop Viganò is revealing to the world that he's questioning some of the things from the council. He says, from Vatican II onwards, a parallel church, that's the first phrase that he used, was built, superimposed over and diametrically opposed to the true Church of Christ. This parallel church progressively obscured the divine institution founded by our Lord in order to replace it with a spurious entity corresponding to the desired universal religion that was first theorized by Masonry. So that's his first talk about, this other entity like a cancer or a virus within the mystical body of Christ, and he calls it a parallel church. He referred to it as a deep church in his first letter to President Donald Trump, which came out like less than a week before this statement. So he's
Mhm.
used deep church, parallel church, and then I have another quote from the address that he gave at the 2020 Catholic Identity Conference, October of that year. He says, one should speak about the role of that apparent majority in the church,
Mhm.
which is actually small in number but extremely powerful, and which, for brevity's sake, I will summarize as the deep church. So notice he says an apparent majority in the church. So this false thing, he says, is existing within the mystical body of Christ, within the church. It's not a completely separate entity. He says, obviously, there are not two churches, something that would be impossible, blasphemous, and heretical. Nor has the one true Church of Christ today failed in her mission, perverting herself into a sect. The Church of Christ has nothing to do with those who, for the past 60 years, have executed a plan to occupy her. The overlap between the Catholic hierarchy and the members of the deep church is not a theological fact, he says, but rather a historical reality that defies the usual categories and as such must be analyzed. For 60 years, he says, we have witnessed the eclipse of the true church by an anti-church that has progressively appropriated her name. So
Yeah.
there
I
you
mean,
have it.
I mean, here's the thing, Matt. I would not disagree with that insofar as that's definitely a legitimate analysis of how to talk about what has happened. Because again, you find similar things like this in the writings of Archbishop Lefebvre. Not exact, but very similar. You also find similar things and I'm me, I'm not one to jump on every mystical vision and prophecy, far from it.
Right.
Nonetheless, in the approved mystics of the church, you find things that sound a lot like this.
Mm-hmm.
We do know that during the end times, there will be an appearance of things like this happening.
Mhm.
Structures of the church seemingly overtaken by the forces of Antichrist and all these kinds of things. I mean, this is something that you could come to the conclusion of, given the circumstance, given the fact that, I mean, you've got your classic examples of Father James Martin, and that crazy guy from Chicago with his crazy masses and things like that. But Bishop
Mhm.
Supich is Cardinal Supich is closing the is canceling Latin Mass every first Sunday or whatever. I mean, you do see these things where you
Right.
go, those in charge of the church, or as opposed to be physicians, are in some ways actually poisoning the body rather than keeping the body healthy, to use a metaphor.
Mhm.
And this has always been the difficulty, Matt, talking about this stuff, where we know the mystical body of Christ is indefectible. We know that. But we
Mhm.
also know that during the time of St. Athanasius, goodness gracious, you would have thought the end was nigh. And you would have
Right.
seen all of these cathedrals and so forth, run by heretics and whoever who maybe legally hadn't split themselves, but they definitely, in the eyes of God, had made themselves a heathen and a publican by teaching and adopting heresy. So again, these are things that he's just trying to make sense of, and I think we can all at least agree with the sentiment.
Sure. And as Taylor has mentioned many times on his channel, our Lord told us that this was going to happen. He said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 15, beware of false prophets, beware of wolves in sheep's clothing. St. Paul said the same thing. I think it's in Acts 20, where he's getting ready to leave. I believe it was Ephesus, and he tells them, you know, guard, I forget the exact language, but tend the church of God, which he purchased with his own blood. And there, after I leave, I know that there's going to arise, false shepherds among you who will devour the flock, something like that. So this shouldn't be a complete surprise or shock to us that there are. Yes, please hit that like button. Shouldn't come as a shock that this is happening, even
Yeah,
though it is shocking, but it shouldn't be completely, because our Lord said this is how it's going to be. There's always going to be Judases.
there will always be Judases. I mean, this is the mystery of iniquity. This is the mystery of iniquity. Again, he can totally cross a line. It's totally possible that Bishop Vigano could cross a line. Let me just say from my line. Let's just say my line. If Bishop Vigano tomorrow came out and said, I'm consecrating bishops and ordaining priests, and they are and anyone who goes to the sacraments of the local diocese has attached himself to the false church, I would say, well, you're a little bit too far there. I would just say
Right,
this doesn't make any sense. But that he has this rhetoric, to me, is not something that I think is too far, and that's just my opinion.
right.
Yeah,
Okay, so we're almost through the main bullet points of his
yeah,
response. He also said, and this is where he starts making a comparison between what he's facing now and what Archbishop Lefebvre faced decades ago. So Archbishop Vigano says in his official response to the DDF's decree,
hmm,
the accusations against him, 50 years ago, in that same palace of the Holy Office, he's using the traditional name
Alice.
for what's now the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre was summoned and accused of schism for rejecting Vatican II.
Hmm.
His defense is mine, Vigano says. His words are mine, and his arguments are mine. Arguments before which the Roman authorities could not condemn him for heresy, having to wait instead for him to consecrate bishops so as to have the pretext of declaring him schismatic and then revoking his excommunication when he was already dead. The scheme is repeated even after half a century. Wait a minute. The scheme is repeated even half a century has demonstrated Archbishop Lefebvre's prophetic choice. And then he concludes basically by saying, I invite all Catholics to pray that the Lord will come to the aid of his church and give courage to those who are persecuted for their faith. So I think the implication is that he's obviously being persecuted, and he's asking for us to pray for him and for all those who are suffering a similar fate. So I'd be interested to know, your thoughts about the comparison between him and Archbishop Lefebvre, because I know you've done a lot of research into the life of Archbishop Lefebvre, the society. I also wanted to mention, as I think the society issued a statement, kind of, um, I don't know if publicly distancing themselves is the right term, but like in their minds, what Archbishop Vigano has said constitutes. What do they say? There is, however, one point which significantly differentiates Vigano from the founder of the SSPX. Archbishop Vigano makes a clear declaration of sedevacantism in his text. in this text we're going over right now. In other words, according to him, Pope Francis is not Pope. And it concludes with saying, this is the Society's statement: Archbishop Lefebvre and the society he founded have not ventured down that perilous road.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah, yeah. So I think again, I don't work for the society, so I always joke, but they do send me free cars all the time. I'm kidding,
yeah.
but yeah, no kidding. But well, I mean, this is the thing. People started automatically comparing what he was doing to Archbishop Lefebvre. People and many people, for example, were saying, Bishop Strickland is the next Archbishop Lefebvre and so forth. Whenever a bishop is standing up in some way and speaking out, automatically, what's the mold for that in the post-conciliar era? It's of course, it's Archbishop Lefebvre. I mean, there's Bishop Castro Mayer for sure, but his response was largely for Campos Brazil, and it was very quiet, and it wasn't really something that was for the universal church, so to speak, which isn't an insult or anything. All the bishops
Right.
should have done what Bishop Castro Mayer did. They should have just kept doing their diocese and their seminaries the way it had always been done, and then it wouldn't have happened. And so he had a great response. It didn't have the same international appeal the way Lefebvre's did. So I think the society is just trying to say, listen, there's some comparisons here, but there is a distinction, and that's true. Archbishop Lefebvre, people will try to paint him as a crypto sede. That's the new term that people love. He definitely said at times in the lead up to Assisi that yeah, there may not be certainty on who the Pope is. And again, who in their right mind wouldn't entertain the possibility when you see, you know,
Right.
the head of the Holy See, the Pope doing weird things with other religions at Assisi? Of course, you're going to have these things, but he was very clear that from an official position, the society would never adopt it, and they haven't, and that's kind of the distinction.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yep. So maybe we can now get more into where Archbishop Vigano stands on whether or not Francis is the Pope, what he actually thinks about that
yeah.
based on his own writings and speeches. So just to go back to, let's remind ourselves, what are the three prongs of this Vatican charge of schism? Number one, denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis. Number two, rupture of communion with him. And then the third one is rejection of the Second Vatican Council. So I have a couple quotes to share in regard to the denial of legitimacy and rupture of communion claims.
Hmm.
The first one, yeah, I wondered for a long time, because Archbishop Vigano was kind of hinting at it throughout 2021, 2022, as I recall, that he may hold that Francis is not the Pope. But then in October of 2023, he issued a text called Vitium Consensus. And he says in that document, I'll just read some of the highlights. He says, taking notice of the fact that Bergoglio is a heretic, so he
Hmm.
certainly does hold that. And Vigano says, and Amoris Laetitia, or his declaration of the intrinsic immorality of capital punishment, would be enough to prove it that he is a heretic. We must ask ourselves if the 2013 election was in some way invalidated by a lack of consent. That's his theory. And he explains what he means. That is, if the one elected wanted to become Pope of the Catholic Church, or rather head of what he calls, quote, our synodal church, which has nothing to do with the Church of Christ precisely because it stands as something other than it.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that language, if he means that it's still something that technically exists within the mystical body of Christ, or if he's gotten to the point where he thinks that they are two completely separate entities. I don't know. But he
Yeah.
said last October, in my opinion, this lack of consent can also be seen in Bergoglio's behavior, which is ostentatiously and consistently anti Catholic and heterogeneous with respect to the very essence of the papacy. So he goes on in that address to say, I believe instead that his acceptance of the papacy is invalid because he considers the papacy something other than what it is, like a spouse who gets married in church but excludes the specific purposes of marriage from his intention, thus making the marriage null and void precisely due to his lack of consent. Now, I do have one more quote I'll get to in just a minute, but for myself, I'm not aware. Oh, here we go. I'm not aware of any precedent in church history of this theory of lack of consent as an invalidating factor being floated for, a papal election. I don't know if you've ever heard of this before. I did ask a priest who was very knowledgeable, and he said he's never heard of this theory in church history. He's never seen it in his copious research of the sub of church history and the fathers of the church and stuff. So I don't know if there's any precedent for it or not. Personally, I don't know of any.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. There's someone someone in the chat that I just want to respond to quickly here, though, because I think this represents one of the main problems with the let's say ignorance of a lot of Catholics. And I don't mean this as an insult, although the person does call himself a Zoomer, so that can't be good. But basically, this gentleman here, I think, maybe guy or girl, I don't know, scholastic Zoomer, assuming that a pope has fallen into heresy, which is not a private declaration but a public legal one, since the church isn't represented by one member but by the bishops of the world at a council. So this person has been saying in the chat over and over again that to say that the pope is a heretic basically necessarily makes you a schismatic or some sort of grave sin. Here's the problem, my friends. And again, scholastic Zoomer, I mean this as something that I'm trying to help you here. Go get a book called Ultramontanism and Tradition. I've recommended this book 1,000 times, and I'll recommend it 1,000 times more. What to do with the notion of a heretical pope is not something that there is a clear answer on in church history from the first millennium and the second millennium. You can go through, there's a couple essays in that book, and they're long. They're like 20, 30-page essays written by amazing contemporary theologians, going through the fathers, the scholastics, theologians, canonists, and so forth. There is, generally speaking, a moral majority amongst the great who's who of saints and so forth in church history that if a pope were to commit heresy, he would essentially lose his office. That's actually an uncomfortable fact people don't like to deal with. On the other hand, there is a moral majority that no one really knows how he could be deposed, and he couldn't be deposed. So when someone says that they believe that the pope has uttered a heresy or written a heresy, it is not the same thing as saying, I now believe that he is officially no longer the pope, because those are two separate questions that theologians have been trying to deal with for a really long time, and no one has a clear answer. Also, sorry, go on, Matt.
Can I interject something
Yeah.
real quick? So recently, in recent issues of Catholic Family News, Father Albert Callio, the traditional Dominican that you're going to be going on pilgrimage with,
That's
has
right.
written about this subject. Actually, he's summarized the treatise that John of St. Thomas wrote on the subject. So if folks subscribe to Catholic Family News, you visit catholicfamilynews.com and click on the subscribe tab at the top. Everyone who subscribes, whether you get the print edition or the digital only, you get access to the digital edition, and you can access those articles because they're very helpful for understanding some of that stuff. Because John of St. Thomas is one of the main players.
He is. And by the way, there's the link, ladies and gentlemen, catholicfamilynews.com, and you can go there. You can do new subscription. It's very easy. It's a very easy to use website. So go there and check that. catholicfamilynews.com, very easy to remember. And it's worth it. I mean, it's like $3 an issue or something like that. You can't beat it.
Yeah, it's for it to get a physical newspaper delivered to your home plus access to the digital edition is only $42 for an entire year. So 12 issues. If you want the digital only, it's only $32 for a year. So we'd greatly appreciate your support.
Yeah, and the point is that these theologians, nowhere do you find in the works of these great, who's who of Catholic theology, that if you were to believe and even speak of the Pope having committed, written, uttered, etc., a heresy, no one believed that automatically made you some sort of schismatic. That's just not found in the tradition of the church. It may be there'd be some opinions of some that would suggest that, but it's not a consensus.
Because it's never been formally, none of this has ever been formally defined by the magisterium itself.
Right.
These are all essentially opinions.
That's right. Okay.
So yeah, getting back to some of these quotes about, I'm assuming that the people, if they've actually conducted a real investigation, which is, I don't know if that's
maybe
actually
yes, maybe no.
not.
We're not really sure.
Yeah. But if they did, I would assume they'd be looking at these texts and going through them similar to what we're doing and seeing, does this mean that he, denies Vatican II or denies the legitimacy of Pope Francis, whatever. Mm-hmm. So he ends towards the end of his text, Vitium Consensus, from last October. He says, so here I am, throwing the proverbial stone into the pond. I would like us to take seriously, very seriously, the possibility that Bergoglio intended to obtain the election by means of fraud, and that he intended to abuse the authority of the Roman pontiff in order to do the exact opposite of what Jesus Christ gave mandate to St. Peter and his successors to do, namely, confirm the faithful in the Catholic faith, feeding and governing the flock of the Lord, preaching the gospel to the nations. And now, ladies and gentlemen, we have a treat for you. We have the man himself. We have a video clip of from a lecture that he gave last December during an online conference hosted by Dr. Ed Maza. As you may recall, Kennedy and I discussed some of that earlier this year. I think it was back in February. I wrote a two-part series for CFN on whether or not Benedict validly resigned. For Viganò, he doesn't seem like he's mentioned, maybe the resignation wasn't valid, but I don't, to my knowledge, he doesn't hold that Benedict's resignation was invalid, and therefore that's why Francis is not the Pope. For Viganò, it's all about this lack of consent theory. But this is what Archbishop Viganò said last December, which I think gives some very important insight into where he's at with this issue.
Can we be morally certain, then, that the tenor of Santa Marta is a false prophet? My answer is yes. Are we therefore authorized in conscience to revoke our obedience to someone who presenting himself as Pope is, in reality, acting like the biblical wild boar in the Lord's vineyard, or like the hireling, who is not the shepherd, whose own the sheep are not, and who has no care for the sheep? Yes. What we cannot do, because we do not have the authority, is to officially declare that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is not Pope.
So did everybody catch that? He said, what we cannot do, because we don't have the authority, is officially declare that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is not Pope. That's pretty significant, I think.
Yeah.
In which we find ourselves makes any human solution impossible. Our task must not be to engage in abstract speculation of canonists, but to resist with all our strength, with the help of God's grace, the explicitly destructive action of the Jesuit Argentine, refusing with courage and determination any collaboration, even indirect collaboration, with him and his accomplices.
Now, there is, to play devil's advocate here, because again, we're not telling ladies and gentlemen what you have to believe. Right. I understand why people, like Eric Salmon's, very good friend of both of ours. I really respect that man. He's got a great sense of humor, which is good because you won't be able to deal with me if you don't. And he thinks that Viganò's gone too far. Okay, because you know what? There's a line in there where you could say, okay, maybe he's gone too far. And the line there is refusing to have anything to do with Francis or even his accomplices.
And revoking obedience, like, completely, not just in particular cases, but in principle, I think would be the other thing.
That's so again, that could be an argument towards Bishop Viganò being a schismatic. However, one must entertain the nature of authority. I mean, this is something too. I mean, again, talking to Bishop Schneider a couple of days ago, again, not about Bishop Viganò, but just about other things. And he was lamenting to me how in the time since really sort of the conciliar era, basically communion has been boiled down to external compliance. And it's never been the understanding and history of the church. I mean, again, I write about this in my book, SSPX The Defense. You can find a link for that in the description area of this podcast. I talk about how, I mean, there are saints and heroes who have legitimately, essentially resisted the Pope to his face. One of them was Bishop Grosseteste from England. And he basically told the Pope he can go pound salt about the Pope wanting him to consecrate essentially one of his nephews or something like that to be a bishop in one of the cathedrals in England. And he knew it was a case of flat nepotism. It wasn't a heresy. People will say things like, well, you can only disobey in times of when he's asking you to commit a mortal sin. It's like, that's not really true, is it? Because it wouldn't have been a mortal sin for him necessarily to consecrate this bishop. He just knew that this bishop would have been a bad bishop. He was informed properly. He was a young man. It was one of those lamentable eras in church history where there was corruption in Rome. And so it really was a question of, hey, the moral authority that you have as Pope is being abused right now, and I refuse to do what you're asking me. That's something that's happened in church history here. So the notion is not outside the realm of possibility, but the extension of which Bishop Viganò is going with it is, I believe, in some cases, objectively seen as problematic.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah.
So I think the last thing we have to cover is the texts from Viganò's past writings regarding, this charge of so-called rejection of the Second Vatican Council and whether or not that's accurate. I do have some quotes to share with you all. The first one is from what my superior at CFN, Brian McCall, refers to as the second letter on Vatican II in this book, A Voice in the Wilderness, again from Angelus Press. And he says in there, and this letter is dated June 14th, 2020. We did publish it on the Catholic Family News website. Regarding the possibility of making a correction to the acts of the Second Vatican Council, which is what Bishop Schneider proposes needs to be done, I think that we can agree the heretical propositions or those which favor heresy should be condemned, and we can only hope that this will happen as soon as possible. My objection to Bishop Schneider, meaning, like, I think what Taylor calls it, like the line item veto option that colloquially that's what he calls it for bishops, because Bishop Schneider basically thinks that the ambiguous or erroneous phrases need to be excised, crossed out from the text, or formally explained, or something needs to be done about them. But the document as a whole can stay, can survive that process. Archbishop Viganò disagrees, and he explains his position. So his objection to that idea stems rather from my concern about the possibility that there will be preserved among the official acts of the Church a hapax, which I think is based on a Greek term, which means like a word that only appears once in the corpus of somebody's works. So this anomaly, basically, that beyond ambiguous formulations of discontinuity, was intended and conceived for its subversive value, and which as such has caused many evils. So in other words, even if the line item veto thing or the excising of bad phrases from the documents would happen, you can't erase the fact that they were still there at one point, and that they were planted there deliberately to be exploited after the council, as the progressives, the modernists themselves have admitted in their own writings.
Like the word subsist.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Prime example, Lumen Gentium 8. So Viganò says, from a legal point of view, the most suitable solution may perhaps be found, but from the pastoral point of view, that is, as regards the council's usefulness for the edification of the faithful, it is preferable to let the whole thing drop and be forgotten. That's his solution to the problem of Vatican II. It should just be dropped and forgotten. He also says it should be remembered that the event of the council far surpasses the documents which it produced. The event meaning like the modernist coup that took place at the beginning of the council, and ultimately the victory of, in a certain sense, the victory of modernism over the conservative or traditional minority headed by people like Archbishop Lefebvre and Bishop Castro de Meyer. All of that, you can't separate that history from the documents, in other words, is what he's saying.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah. What's funny, this position here, sorry, I'll take this away. I'm just talking to a screen here of text. This back and forth between Viganò and Schneider is it's very indicative of the general themes and trends within the traditionalist critique of the council. I think Bishop Schneider's thoughts are closer aligned with the Society of St. Pius X, although it's not really exactly clear exactly. I don't know if the society is necessarily, they may have, because not all public from the negotiations.
I would be curious to know, just to interject real quick, where the society stands exactly, like what their expectations are in that regard. That's a little off topic, but I'd be very
On
curious
Vatican
to know.
II?
Yeah, and what needs to be done. Where do they agree more with Bishop Schneider's approach, or do they agree more with Viganò's approach? That'd be very interesting to know that.
From my understanding, and I spent a lot of time with society priests. I was just in England and spending a lot of time at the priory there with a lot of priests who've been around for a long time. Some were either trained or ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre. And really, the concern of the society over the decades has been going to Rome and saying, here is what the church has always taught. Here's what's in the council. Please square this circle for us. That's kind of been the concern. Mm-hmm. What to do with that in the end, I don't really think anybody really knows. But it's just more of an awareness, like, again, with religious freedom and things like that. This is what you are saying. This is what has been said until 1965. Please tell us how we're supposed to still believe the one from before and take the one after. And it's pretty much always resulted in some sort of impasse for obvious reasons. So I don't know if they have a specific opinion about what to do with the documents if there were to be a consensus arrived at.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I guess my position on this is that I don't necessarily have a preference one or the other, but one of the two or something has to be done, obviously. We can't go on like this forever, having these ambiguous and even sometimes erroneous statements in official council documents. That's not acceptable. Something has to be done. So I agree with Bishop Schneider and Archbishop Viganò in that regard.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to put this guy on here again. Sorry, Mr. Whatever Zoomer person. I just want to put your thing up here. He made a comment about, it's actually probably, this is to me very strange. If you obey something that is materially heretical because of obedience to proper authority, there is certainly no culpability and it is likely meritorious. I can't understand that mentality, and I can't understand that at all. It's meritorious to obey something that is materially heretical.
Heresy is mortal sin, so it would be sinful.
That also doesn't really make any sense because material heresy, as far as I understand, maybe you can correct me, Matt. That's when you don't know you've done something heretical. So you're preaching from the pulpit and you say something wrong about the nature of Christ or something like that. And then you've committed material heresy in the sense of you've made a mistake where somebody comes to you after and says, by the way, that's a heresy. You go, oopsie daisy. And the next week you correct it from the pulpit. Now you're not a formal heretic. So if you know the thing is heretical, there's no material thing there. You're just, it's heretical. You can't obey that. That doesn't make any sense. There's this weird, strange. Yeah. Go on.
Here's a scenario that comes to mind because I did some parish work before I took the job with Catholic Family News, and so a scenario. I'm not saying this actually happened, but hypothetically, if you're working at a parish and the pastor or one of the priests there says something heretical and wants you to incorporate that into the catechetical teaching at the parish or something, even if he's not aware that what he's saying is heretical, if it's material heresy, I would have an obligation, according to St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, in the Summa, to fraternally correct him and say, I'm sorry, Father, but that's actually not correct. That's actually heretical for X, Y, and Z. That's what St. Thomas Aquinas taught in the Summa, that inferiors, when the faith is in danger, even superiors can correct, or even inferiors can correct their superiors.
Yeah, exactly. And
I wouldn't be able to just say, well, Father doesn't really know what he's doing, so I can go along with this if I do. No, because then I would be in formal heresy if I know that it's heretical.
Yeah. So there's no. Again, you made the correct statement of saying heresy is mortal sin. This is something that's lost in a lot of these conversations, is the actual moral and spiritual implications. It's not as if this is representative of this age of legalism that we live in, this legal positivism, where we look at things from canon law or even law and society. We went through similar things because, again, we say that the world reflects the state of the church. And I don't think there's any coincidence that the revolution in the churches in the 60s and the revolutions in society are in the 60s as well. It makes perfect sense to me. And it's continued on and on. And during the COVID time, we had lots of people saying, well, we know it's wrong, but just do it anyway. It's like, well, no, I don't do things that I know are wrong. There's no virtue in doing, the Bible says that the head of state has authority, but it also tells me not to sin. So I'm supposed to probably think of the sin thing first, because obedience is a virtue and it can't be meritorious unless you do something virtuous. So there can be no virtue in obeying something that you know to be heretical because you can't separate legal things from moral things. You can't separate the spirit of the law from the letter of the law. That's what Pharisees do, and we can't be Pharisees. By the way, Juliet in the comments says, I'd love to hear what you have to say about the Father Rodrigue video. I will do a show on that. I have done a show on Father Rodrigue before called False Prophet and something. You can find that, but we won't do that in this show here, but I'll do that at some point.
Oh, she says Father Rodriguez. Is that some? But you're
I think
saying
I think she's just spelling Rodrigue wrong. It's Rodrigue with no Z,
Oh,
and that was that big thing this morning. A bunch of these Catholic influencers did a thing with
okay.
this. He's the priest that said that Pope Benedict would be murdered. And
Okay, I'll have to look more into that. I'm not real familiar. When I saw Father Rodriguez, I thought of Father Michael Rodriguez.
No,
with
not from the Fatima Center.
Fatima Center.
No different.
Okay.
This was a big thing. It was on like 24 different channels.
Oh, wow.
There was some messages from heaven or something. This is a very, very strange thing. Anyway, I'll do another show about that at some point because it deserves its own thing, but it's a different topic.
So real quick, I'll interject a little humor. Did you see because we're discussing a very heavy topic, so we need some comic relief. Did you see the tweet yesterday of somebody made a meme with everybody? There are people on an airline, all these Catholic celebrities, including Taylor, and some of the seats are open. But you have quite a mixture. You got like Taylor is on a window seat, and Father James Martin is on the aisle seat. And the meme is like, pick your seat? Where would you sit? I thought that was pretty funny.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll send it to you so you can see. I thought you might have seen it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
so where are we at here, Matt?
Back,
where are we at here, Matt? With this plan here.
Yes. So I want to read a couple more texts just to show that Archbishop Viganò, at least in the past, has acknowledged that Vatican II was a legitimate council. So he said in September of 2020, and this was in response to I think two articles that were written against him, one by Father Wenandi, I think the Franciscan priest, and also Father Raymond de Souza, basically accusing him of a schism way back then. He said, Vatican II, although a legitimate ecumenical council, as I have elsewhere affirmed, is not like the others, because if this were the case, the councils and the magisterium that preceded it would have had to be held as equally binding, not only in words, preventing the formulation of the errors contained or implied in the texts of Vatican II. So he does recognize that it was legitimately convened, at least he did 4 years ago. He also says in another text from September 2020, the central vice of the council lies in having, and vice he's talking about John the 23rd and Paul the 6th going along with the modernist, what he calls surprise attacks in violation of the norms which they themselves approved. He says the central vice in all of that lies in having fraudulently led the council fathers to approve ambiguous texts, which they considered Catholic enough to deserve the placet or the vote in favor of them, and then using that same ambiguity to get them to say exactly what the innovators wanted. Those texts cannot today be changed in their substance to make them orthodox or clearer. They must simply be rejected, he says, according to the forms that the supreme authority of the Church shall judge appropriate in due course, since they are vitiated by a malicious intention. And it will also have to be determined whether an anomalous and disastrous event such as Vatican II can still merit the title of ecumenical council. But he does say it's up to the supreme authority of the Church. He's not saying just take this matter into your own hands, but at some point the Pope, a future Pope, is going to have to deal with this in some manner. So,
We should also just interject here that Sarmad, my good friend, who's a moderator, he said I would sit next to James Martin so I can teach him the Catholic faith.
There you go.
Now, Sam, would you wear Sarmad? Would you wear a mask if you sat next to James Martin? Because he'd probably wear one beside you anyway.
That's funny. All right. He also said in his Catholic Identity Conference speech from October 2020, we have seen that the actions carried out, this is Viganò again, during Vatican II have had the desired effect, giving concrete form to that anthropological turning point which today has led to the apostasy of the anti-church and the eclipse of the true church of Christ. Therefore, let us put aside once and for all the vain distinctions concerning the presumed good of the council, the betrayal of the will of the synod fathers, the letter and spirit of Vatican II, the magisterial weight or lack thereof of its acts, and the hermeneutic of continuity versus that of rupture. The anti-church, he says, has used the label ecumenical council to give authority and legal force to its revolutionary agenda. This is like the event of the council he talked about earlier. Just as Bergoglio calls his political manifesto of allegiance to the New World Order an encyclical letter. And I'm guessing at the time he was referring to Fratelli Tutti, which I think had just recently come out. But lastly, in regard to this claim that he rejects Vatican II, Michael Matt actually asked him this question in the 2022 Catholic Identity Conference during a live interview. He said, so this is Michael Matt's question. Francis has proclaimed that traditionalists, quote, reject Vatican II. Given that on February 14th, 2013, Pope Benedict XVI said the council had been hijacked by the media, thus doing incalculable damage to the church and banalizing the liturgy, shouldn't all Catholics, quote, reject the council as it was presented to the world, according to Benedict, by the media? And here's how Viganò, this is part of his response. First of all, it must be clarified that the media contribution to the conciliar narrative is only partial and marginal compared to the clearly subversive content of Vatican II, which was intended by its authors. There is no phantom good council that was supposedly betrayed by the modernists. In this, Bergoglio is perfectly right, says Viganò. Catholics who want to remain faithful to tradition reject Vatican II precisely because it is alien and opposed to tradition, which is the norm of faith. Now, I would assume that Archbishop Viganò recognizes that there are plenty of orthodox statements in the council documents. I mean, that's pretty much undeniable. I think even the society recognizes that fact. Yeah. But what he's ultimately saying is, even if the texts that are problematic are only a small minority, it still poisons the whole batch, I think is basically his point.
I want to chime in on that too, because I think something that Bishop Viganò has been saying about the council is quite insightful. It's that even if we go through and we correct it, etc., the whole conciliar thing is still a thing. The whole conciliar event, the whole conciliar paradigm, the legacy of that thing, it sticks around. And the legacy of that thing has been confusing. I think the smartest, if I'm being as fair as possible to my fellow Catholics that disagree with me, I wish they'd be fair to me. Some of them are, most of them aren't. I do think that the smartest of the bunch are really the Bishop Barron Nouvelle Théologie crowd. Again, I don't agree with their conclusions or their methods on things, but when I was reading through a lot of their work to try to insert in my book that I just submitted to Sophia on modernism, and I read a lot of stuff from those scholars, and they're very smart men. They are not idiots. They are well read. They are not amateurs. They know what they're doing. And in those men, and in my opinion, these are the smartest of the bunch as far as their scholastic chops are concerned, their academic chops. And there's something in the whole paradigm of the conciliar formation that needs to be rooted out. because even in these men, and they would probably say the same thing about me, so fair enough, but even in these men who are as smart as you can get studying this stuff, there's still this hangover of the errors of modern philosophy. I'll give you an example. I was looking up some stuff to try to understand some of Ratzinger's earlier work. So I found an article on Word on Fire written by a Jesuit, not James Martin, but an actual serious scholar. Very, very intelligent man. Like, again, this is, I'm reading this and I'm going, this is a world-class academic paper in its own right as far as, academia is concerned. But the interesting thing about this is that what he was trying to prove is that that Cardinal Ratzinger, Father Ratzinger, from when he was a priest and then Bishop Ratzinger, he was trying to prove that he was more in line with Kierkegaard's understanding of Christian community than Hegel's. And I thought to myself, why the heck are we debating either of those things? Because both of those men are heretics, and right. Kierkegaard was ultimately some sort of subjectivist who thought we had to take a leap of faith. There was really no certainty of the truths of the faith. And I'm thinking to myself, there's just something here where this is a guy who has an extremely big brain. This is not a dummy. He's a very good writer. He's extremely well read. But there is this thing in the conciliar paradigm where it's infected or infiltrated, etc., infested itself in the consciousness of this conciliar moment, this conciliar event that's still there. So there really is a very prudential question to ask, which I think Bishop Viganò is kind of asking or kind of trying to give an answer to, is that even if you correct the thing, the hangover and the structure of that disorder is still going to be there. And I think that's a valid concern to have.
Yeah, absolutely. I wrote one of the first significant series that I wrote for CFN when John Venari, God rest his soul, was still alive and the editor of the publication. I wrote a series on Vatican II in light of tradition. It was based on a petition that was circulated by a group of like 50 scholars, priests, academics, petitioning Pope Benedict XVI at the time for an in-depth review of the council documents in light of tradition. And they asked a set of very specific questions, getting into the nitty-gritty of the council documents and the problematic statements. And the first article in my series was giving the background, the war against modernism, because you cannot understand Vatican II as an event. You can't understand the council at all without understanding that crucial history 150 years before the council, just like Taylor covers in Infiltration. You can't understand the council apart from that history and from the fight against modernism, because as that history shows, men who were literally suspect of heresy by the Holy Office during the reign of Pius XII were appointed as theological experts by John the 23rd. That's a historical fact.
It's a historical fact, and there's a red pill that a lot of people don't want to take, and it's about Cardinal Ratzinger. And right now and by the way, the Scholastic Zoomer, yes, there is an interpretation of Genesis that is de fide, about parts of it at least. And the de fide thing, you can find it in Fundamentals of Catholic Dogma. You can also find it in the letter written by Pope Leo XIII, Arcanum, that Adam was created specially by God out of the stuff of the earth. That is something that no one can deny. It's a de fide proposition. So there are de fide propositions in Genesis, by the way, Mr. Zoomer friend. But also, there's an article right now on Catholic Answers by our favorite theologaster. He's this guy from Louisiana. We'll leave it at that. It's not Mike Church. We actually like him. And Mike Church is good people. We're not talking about him. And it talks about how you don't actually have to accept every statement in the Bible as inspired by God. And he cites Ratzinger, who had a theory called the Vere Enunziata. Sorry for my Italianization of the Latin. And Ratzinger was convinced, and I have it cited in my book, and you can find it in Nova et Vetera, the scholastic journal that is still in print, but now is run by the St. Paul Center. It's not as good as it used to be, of course, because of the conciliar mess, but it's still in print from 100 years or so. And it's defended that Ratzinger wrote, and he said this to the bishops of Germany on the eve of the council, as an esteemed theologian, as you say. And he was, at this time, people have to remember too, Ratzinger was suspected by his professor I think it was University of Munich, as being purely a modernist, and he suspected him of heresy as a student. And Ratzinger said that there were errors historically in the Bible. And so he came up with this, and he was talking not just about Genesis, he was talking about the Gospels. Okay, usually the Catholic Answers crowd, the kind of neo-modernist, theistic evolution crowd, they're not going to say there's errors in the Gospels. That's kind of taboo. They're going to go back to the first 11 books of Genesis and say it's a myth without saying it's a myth. But usually they don't go that boldly. And he said that the theory was called vere enunciata, which vere, true, enunciata, enunciate or express. And he said what the theory basically meant was that it's not that the authors were, it's not that there isn't inspiration in the Bible. It's that only the things where the Holy Ghost intended to inspire the author are the things that are inspired, which is a way of saying the Bible isn't all inspired. You can gussy it up all you want, and this is defended by an article at Catholic Answers today, and this is something that Cardinal Ratzinger was a fan of. Now, I do believe Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, I do believe he kind of, Bishop Tissier wrote a long essay on Ratzinger called "Faith Imperiled by Reason." And he gave a description of Ratzinger, which I think was apt. And he said, you get the impression of this man who was groping for truth for his whole life and kind of just trying to find it. And it does seem, as he aged and as he read more and more and sort of grew in his offices, that he did become more conservative. And I do think that's true. But nonetheless, as you say, there are problems that are in this whole conciliar generation that are deep-seated, and even with men who we would consider heroes in the church today.
And there's also a difference between being conservative and being traditional.
That's right.
And my favorite treatment of that subject is an article by Dr. Peter Kwasniewski at 1 Peter 5. I think it's called "Conservatism is Liberalism in Slow Motion," if I remember correctly. That phrase appears in the article. I can't remember the name of the article, but that phrase appears in the article. Conservatism is liberalism in slow motion. That's such an accurate statement.
What did Chesterton say about? He said the job of liberals is to, what do you say? The job of liberals is to make mistakes, and the job of conservatives is to make sure they never get fixed, or something like that. It's just this back and forth. Okay, where are we at now in this corpus of our plan here, Matt? Let's get back on track.
Sure. Well, that pretty much concludes the excerpts that I prepared from Archbishop Viganò's writings regarding the three-pronged charge of schism, which again is the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith is claiming Archbishop Viganò's in schism for denial of the legitimacy of Pope Francis, rupture of communion with him, and rejection of the Second Vatican Council. Right. So based on these texts, I mean, obviously we're not the judges in the case, nor are we canon lawyers or anything, but I don't know what your take is on if he's guilty of these charges. I mean, first of all, what does it mean? What does the word legitimacy mean in reference to Pope Francis? Is he truly the Pope? As we heard Archbishop Viganò say in that clip, I'm going to find the quote here in my notes so I can read it exactly. What we cannot do, he said, because we do not have the authority, is to officially declare that Jorge Mario Bergoglio is not Pope. So he's not declaring that definitively. He is saying that he believes that he probably isn't due to that lack of consent theory, but I don't think that Archbishop Viganò has definitively said, I know for certain, and therefore I officially declare that Bergoglio is not Pope. I think his statement about revoking, are we therefore authorized in conscience to revoke our obedience to someone who, presenting himself as Pope, is in reality acting like the biblical wild boar? I think in particular cases we are able, and in particular circumstances, like on a case-by-case basis, we can refuse to obey or comply. But I think revoking that in principle, just in a general sweeping sense, that to me is problematic.
It is, and I'm going to offer my opinion on this thing too, because Bishop Schneider just came out with a statement basically saying he thinks it'd be wise to not charge Viganò. And
yeah,
and I'm gonna agree with that. even if I were to, again, like for example, Eric Salmon's a very good friend of mine. His opinion is legitimate and he has his reasons, and I see his reasons. The reason why I would agree with Bishop Viganò or Bishop Schneider is, well, I don't expect anything wise to happen in Rome these days. Yeah. But as we said at the outset, kind of joking, this is the church of mercy, my friends. This is the church of what's happening now. This is the church of dialogue and ecumenism and
Pachamama.
Synodality. I mean, Pope Francis is receiving fake blessings from Anglican clerics and so forth,
and receiving vulgar comedians in public audience in the Vatican.
There's no such thing as schism in the Church of the New Springtime because no one's outside of it. Father Calderone, Society rector of Society Seminary. I think he was rector of the Society Seminary in Argentina for years. I know he's a Society priest. He wrote a book called Prometheus. I recommend everybody get that book because he's actually quite funny, and he spent a lot of time studying Vatican II. And he has diagrams in it which are kind of funny. And he kind of goes through like all the claims of the sort of conciliarists and the in light of the documents and so forth, like what constitutes someone being in the church. And he basically kind of shows the circles keep getting bigger and bigger, but the only one who's not in it is traditionalists. And he says the only people in hell, according to the conciliarists, are Hitler and a few traditionalists. And and that's pretty much the case. I mean, who is outside the church in the mind of these people nowadays? Nobody's really outside the church because, the ignorance, they don't really know, blah, 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 blah. Of course, I don't think that's true. But what I do believe is that even if one could make the case that Bishop Viganò has gone too far, this would only harm any possible reconciliation of traditionalists and non-traditionalists in a peaceable sense, because it's a selective use of power. It's not even really a legitimate application thereof, because I mean you're basically just accusing the man of things based on things that are kind of debatable, and what Viganò himself has said isn't even really clear. There will be no.
I was just going to say, we ultimately know that the men who are involved in examining the case are most likely heavily biased against him. That's another big part of this scenario, which is part of why he said he would not go to Rome at all. Let me see if I can find that. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, yeah, but and I'll also say this too, and I'm saying this with the most respect and no, I'm not trying to be patronizing at all. Bishop Viganò is not a young man. He is an old man. And he has been in the war for a very, very long time, and he has done some very heroic things. And he's been very wounded, and he's been reviled and so forth. And I just do not think this is the approach that someone should be taking with a man who has given his life for service of the church, when there isn't even really full clarity in the things that he's said. It just seems to me to be a very silly use of power, and I don't mean this in the cringe, Church of Mercy Pope Francis sense, but really is unmerciful. I find it very unmerciful. Really, it should be. I mean, and I don't know what goes on behind the scenes, but there's not a lot that goes on that Bishop Viganò isn't publishing, it seems. I mean, really, there should just be a call. I mean, if anything, we're asking, to pray for Bishop Viganò that he finds peace or something. I mean, there's a million ways they could go about this that would be consistent with a legitimate, like, look how they dealt with Martin Luther. I mean,
right.
It took them a long time to excommunicate that man and it was seen as a tragedy. This has been one of the things that I find so disgusting with the theologasting blowhards of the New Springtime on YouTube.
Oh, they are salivating. They are like eagerly awaiting this.
It's wicked.
This excommunication.
It's completely wicked what they're doing. It's disgusting. There's no charity. There's people who talk about charity. One of the fruits, and Schneider and I were talking about this, Bishop Schneider. One of the fruits of real schism is no charity, and I see no charity whatsoever in these men going after Bishop Viganò in the public media sphere. They're acting as if this is some sort of win. And this comes back to something I've been thinking
like it's a public spectacle or a circus or something in the Colosseum. That's how they're treating it.
They're treating it like that. And this is something I've gone through my own life where I've, because obviously, shocker, ladies and gentlemen, I'm an SSPX guy, as everyone knows. And I've dealt with this a lot in my personal life. I remember having some very strange, difficult conversations with Catholics that I was friends with for a long time and worked with, and apostolates and that kind of stuff. And we get to the point, and I would say, if you're telling me that I'm outside the church, you're telling me that I'm going to hell. And they were horrified, like, well, I'm not saying that. And it's like, no, but you are saying that, or we don't believe the same thing about religion, because I believe there's no salvation outside the church, because that's been taught forever. We can debate about the extensions of baptism of desire and baptism of martyrdom and so forth, and those things are real things. And I do a 3-hour podcast basically reading an audiobook with our mutual friend, Mr. James Hanish, his work on the subject. But nonetheless, there's no salvation outside the church, and it's a very strict doctrine. And the invincible ignorance thing does not go that far as people think it does. And ignorance itself is not salvific. But the point is that when I would talk to these people, I would say, what you're doing is you're treating the Catholic faith like it's a club. You don't believe I'm going to hell if I'm not in it, because you think, especially these charismatics, they think that Protestants have the Holy Spirit. Well, I'm going to give you a little theology here, my friends. God is a Trinity. So if you get one, you get all three, by the way. And in order to have all three of them, you have to be in a state of grace, because it's Basic Catechism 101 from your St. Joseph Catechism, preparing for your first communion class. If you commit a mortal sin, the Holy Trinity does not dwell within your soul. And we're not partialists, because that's a heresy. We don't believe they split off into different parts and you get to have pieces of God here and there. That's not how it works. And so if one is there, all three are there. So if the Protestants have the Holy Ghost, which virtually every conciliarist would believe in some sense, then they can't be in a state of mortal sin. So how the heck are they heretics? And how the heck are they schismatic? So my point is that there's no possible way that they can do this sort of thing against Bishop Viganò without further destroying and delegitimizing the authority in the church and causing more confusion about the doctrines that are perennial.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I pulled up this interview that Bishop Schneider granted to Religion News Service, which I think is generally a pretty liberal publication from what I've seen in the past. But he's quoted as saying, Archbishop Viganò, is in error because he is voicing a new theory of the probably invalid theory of Francis's illegitimate election, which Schneider says has no foundation. Schneider also claimed to have asked Viganò, who's been living in hiding, where is this? But he ultimately says, as you mentioned earlier, that I think the Pope would be wise and prudent if he were to not excommunicate Archbishop Viganò, adding that with this act, the Holy See will increase divisions even more. So, and that's certainly the case.
Yeah. I get it. I think he's exactly correct. There's no possible way that this will make anything better. And they don't believe in schism. They don't believe no salvation outside the church. They don't believe in the perennial doctrines of the Catholic Church. They've made this clear many, many times. They're blessing homosexuals and unions and stuff. A couple is a union, by the way, because the words are synonyms, you morons. So, I mean, yeah, it's just, it's not the same. It's not the exact same. But when Archbishop Lefebvre would say things like, I'd be excommunicated from Freemasonry, I mean, this is where we are right now, is you're excommunicated, you're called a schismatic because you don't accept heresy. I mean, it's like, okay. I mean, I guess, anyway, it doesn't make any sense. There's just confusion. You can fall down on either side of this. I'm sympathetic towards Bishop Viganò from a perspective of, he's a fellow Catholic. He's done a lot of good. I find things in his statements that are contradictory, so I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt with the things that are in line with the faith, and that's just the way I'm going to do it.
And ultimately, what Archbishop Viganò, he issued a statement after. So America Magazine, apparently, I didn't see this until after the fact, but on June 20th, last Thursday, their Rome correspondent, I think Gerald O'Connell is his name, published an article in which it was claimed that Archbishop Viganò had made an appearance at the Dicastery for the Doctrine of the Faith on the 20th, when he was supposed to. Archbishop Viganò issued a statement saying, no, I didn't. That's not true. He said, I did not go to the Vatican yesterday, and I have no intention of going to the Holy Office on June 28th, tomorrow, which is the deadline specified in the DDF's decree. And ultimately, that decree says if he doesn't at least submit something in writing by tomorrow, then they will just judge the case in his absence. But he says, Archbishop Viganò says, I have no intention of submitting myself to a show trial in which those who are supposed to judge me impartially in order to defend Catholic orthodoxy are at the same time those whom I accuse of heresy, treason, and abuse of power. and among them are precisely the Jesuits, the first proponents of all the moral and doctrinal deviations of the last 60 years, starting with James Martin, S.J., the LGBTQ plus activist who is a regular visitor at Santa Marta. So there you have it.
Yeah, exactly. And someone in the chat, they mentioned how there was a, what is it? The statue of Martin Luther in the Vatican. So, I mean, Martin Luther's in heaven. Maybe Judas is, according to Pope Francis. So I don't see how Viganò is not going to make it either, based on these guys' theology. So anyway, it's just a mess. Yeah. But anything else we should add?
I think just to end on a practical note, what do we do with all of this information, and what do we do with our present circumstances? Whether or not Viganò has gone too far is certainly up for debate, but I ultimately do agree with his statement part of his statement from the clip. He said, "Our task must not be to judge in the abstract speculations of canonists, but to resist with all our strength and with the help of God's grace the explicitly destructive action of the Jesuit Argentine, refusing with courage and determination any collaboration, even indirect collaboration, with him and his accomplices, on a case-by-case basis, obviously. I don't agree, as I mentioned, with revoking our obedience as a matter of principle and just in a sweeping general sense, but we certainly have to resist exactly what St. Robert Bellarmine teaches in On the Roman Pontiff. I can close with this if you'd like, this quote from St. Robert Bellarmine. Just as it would be lawful to resist a pontiff invading a body, so it is lawful to resist him invading souls or disturbing a state, and much more if he should endeavor to destroy the church. I say it is lawful to resist him by not doing what he commands and by blocking him, lest he should carry out his will. Still, it is not lawful to judge or punish or even depose him, because he is nothing other than a superior."
Yeah. There you go. I think that about covers it, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe do you have a few more minutes, Matt?
Yeah, I'm good.
Maybe if anybody wants to ask a question, there are lots of kind of comments in here. But if anyone wants to ask a question, maybe put some question marks in front of it. We can spend another few minutes here. I mentioned the book. People are asking in the chat. I mentioned the book Prometheus by Father Calderone. You can check out that book from Angelus Press. That's a really good book. I also did a show yesterday for my Substack. I should mention as well, ladies and gentlemen, I do have a Substack where I do have exclusive content, and I do a lot there. And I just actually started writing my book on the charismatic renewal yesterday, and I finished the preface, and I'm almost to the introduction. And so that book will be released as articles for paid subscribers. So you'll get a sneak peek of that book there with the audio on the Substack. So lots of goodies there. Thank you. There's about 400 people or so that have signed up so far. And also make sure you go to CatholicFamilyNews.com. You can make sure you get your subscription there. What's going on at Catholic Family News this month?
Well, I did want to mention, I sent you a link to a Catholic Family News article, Viganò's response, and I sent it to you in Signal. I don't know if you're able to pull it up and
I'll pull it up.
display it. This also offers a lot of practical advice on how to deal with our present circumstances. This is from Archbishop Viganò from September of 2020. Mm-hmm. So you can find that on our website. But we're getting towards the end of the month, so we'll have a new paper coming out, the July issue, which has lots of great content in it. Let me pull up the PDF here, and I'll give folks a little.
Yeah, here's some questions here. You pull that up, and I'll just answer some of these as we go.
Sure.
They're coming in hot. They're coming in hard and fast. So I'm trying to make sure I get to the bottom of them here. Okay. So someone asked, will you address the Sultry initiative? What is that? Do you know what that is? Sutri? I don't know what that is.
Sutri. I am not familiar with that.
We won't, because we don't know what it is. That's we can't do that. This is there was a question here about can the Pope be in schism? Oh, can a Pope be in schism? with the long-standing magisterium. Well,
I seem to remember a quote that Dr. Kwasniewski used. It might be in his tract, True Obedience and the Church, when I think it might be from Suarez, talking about if a pope were to go against universal customs or try to abolish liturgical rites or something like that, he could make himself schismatic. I don't remember the exact quote, and I don't have the book handy. It's on my shelf behind me.
I do have, actually, I do have a PDF of the book right here. I'm trying to find that. I don't know if I can find it there.
I don't know. I can't remember if it's in there or not, but I know I've heard the quote before, and I'm pretty sure it's from the works of Suarez. Our friend Ryan Grant would be able to probably recite it off the top of his head.
In Latin.
Yes.
Here's a good question, Kennedy. Do you think charismatics will be more prevalent in the Novus Ordo Mass itself? I'm not really sure what that means. If you mean like as things go on, will they become more charismatic? I don't know. I actually think the charismatic renewals kind of lose steam pretty soon. It's my opinion the charismatic renewal has never really been tested theologically. When you actually look at their their champions of theology, they pretty much only point to Protestants, which is interesting because I watched the Renewal Ministry's rebuttal to all the videos I've done, and they said you shouldn't be listening to these people who question the legitimacy of Vatican II. And then 30 minutes later in the video talking about how they got the idea from Protestants, and I said, well, it's funny, Protestants reject Vatican II as well, so there's really no consistency there. But it's my opinion that the charismatic renewal has not really been tested very much in the theological realm because it's not really logical. I mean, it's a bunch of feelings and emotions. And the main authority they go to is Cardinal Suenens, of all people. And we know Cardinal Suenens very well. He was a dissenter of Humanae Vitae, and he called the Second Vatican Council the French Revolution in the Church. And he said it in a positive sense. So, and even Suenens, he wrote these documents called the Maline documents or something in the late 80s, after about 20 years of the renewal. And his view on what was permissible by Catholic charismatics was very tame compared to what they do nowadays. So even his sort of theological understanding of it was like he did not believe the gift of tongues thing was the way they were saying it, and he basically said it was some sort of personal prayer language and things like that, but didn't think it was a pure charismatic gift. So they don't really have a consistent theology. I think the charismatics have thrived in the age of chaos. There's no secret that they start popping off in 1967 as things are going bananas. And the people who were the progenitors...
Wasn't there some sort of an event at Notre Dame or something where all of this sort of started? Is that correct? Am I remembering that right?
Yeah, Notre Dame's a big part of it, but the initial thing was at Duquesne University. It was called the Duquesne Outpouring, or the Topeka Outpouring was in Kansas, and the Duquesne charismatic outpouring happened later. And it was these very liberal, they were admittedly liberals. I cite a lot of it in my upcoming Sophia book. They were liberals. They were civil rights activists. They were that kind of people. And they were looking for a movement, basically. They went to some Episcopalians.
And it was nuns out of habit, right? Wasn't it a lot of nuns out of habit were involved in this as well?
Oh, they were, yeah. But the originals were scholars. So, of course, because all the stupid things start with academics. And they were scholars. They were scholars and students at Duquesne University. And then it kind of infected all the campuses from there. And but anyway, that generation's kind of dying off, and the young charismatics, if you actually look into it's very sad. I've been researching a lot of the people who grew up in these covenant communities, and a lot of them leave the faith. A lot of them become LGBT and so forth, and or go into weird spiritual practices. There's a whole podcast on this for people who used to be in these communities telling their stories. I've got interviews coming up that I'm going to be doing to do research with people who grew up in these things. And anyway. So yeah, I don't see the charismatic renewal getting much bigger. I think it's kind of dying out, if I can say that. But okay, I'll check another question here, Matt, and then we'll go. Here is one more. Let me see here. Here's one. This is for both of us. Maybe you have more information on this. Have we looked into Pope Paul IV's papal bull cum ex apostolis officio in defense of Viganò as not schismatic. I know of the document. I don't know. I can't think of it in reference to Viganò. Do you know what she's talking about?
I don't. Yeah, I've heard of the document. I can't say that I've studied it in depth. I'm pretty sure it's one that sedevacantists typically point to for their theory. And I know I've read rebuttals to it, but I can't really say anything substantive off the top of my head about it. I apologize.
Sorry, we don't have a better answer for you, Anna. I'll look into it, though. I'll look into it.
I think this general sense, and at least how it's used or misused, as the case may be, is that if someone was a heretic before they were elected, then then they can't be elected the Pope by that very fact. So, but the problem is it's kind of circular reasoning. Like, well, how do you know for certain that they were a heretic if that wasn't legally established beforehand and that kind of stuff? So but yeah, I mean, by that standard, you could, if anyone's suspect of heresy, you could say, well, they were never the real Pope. So there are some problems with that. Something like that.
Yeah. It's there's a website, Unum Sanctum Catholicum. That is, I don't know if that website's good or not, but they have an article on it. I can't find an English translation of it.
I think that's Philip Campbell's blog, if I'm not mistaken, and he's good. He writes for CFN.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'll look into it. Oh yeah, I see here, and they're talking about sedevacantist positions on it and so forth. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing, my friends. Like, again, I'll extend my sympathies, like, and I don't mean that in a patronizing sense whatsoever. I just mean I'm very ecumenical in the traditional sense of this is one of the most confusing times, if not the most confusing times in church history. So I'm going to give people I'm going to give people a lot of leeway as long as they hold on to the dogmas of the faith. And if they come to different conclusions, I'm not going to throw them into the exterior darkness. So, all right, Matt, I think we've answered every possible question. I have to go get back to writing my charismatic book, and I'm recording an audiobook as well. So I got to get to some other things here. Anything you'd like to tell us before we sign off here, Matt?
Oh, I just want to thank everybody who's joined us live. We've had a good size live audience today. I hope this has been helpful for everybody. And just a reminder that this is not something that Kennedy and I do in our free spare time. This is part of our livelihood. So please do support our work. Subscribe to Kennedy's channel, like this video, share it online. Please visit CatholicFamilyNews.com and sign up for a subscription. Again, it's only $42 for an entire year, 12 issues of Catholic Family News, and $42 gets you a physical newspaper mailed to you, in addition to access to the same content just in digital format on a platform called Zinio. Mm-hmm. And then if you just want the digital edition of the paper, it's only $32 for an entire year, 12 issues. Yeah. And we really need, over the last few years, especially with all the COVID debacle and everything that's going on, we really need to boost our subscriber numbers to help keep us going. So please do visit CatholicFamilyNews.com and subscribe.
That's right, ladies and gentlemen. Check that out, CatholicFamilyNews.com. And if you want some more goodies, some more information, some Q&A for subscribers only, there's about 400 people who have signed up as paid subscribers so far over the Substack. Sign up and be part of a growing community, and you get to ask questions. I can't answer every email. I get hundreds of emails a week, but I'm a lot better at answering the DMs on the Substack thing from the subscribers. So there you go. All right. Also, check out the link in the description. I'm going to Italy this fall for a trip with Father Albert Kallio and Catholic Heritage Pilgrimages. We'll be doing and it's going to be November. It's just after the election. So whatever happens, you're probably going to want to get out of America after November 8th.
Oh, that reminds me of the debate. The debate is tonight. That's going to be entertaining, I'm sure.
Yeah, no, my goodness. I can't even believe it's still happening. But we're gonna get it. I'm in Canada, but nonetheless, we're going to get out of Dodge just after the world ends, one way or the other. And we're going to go to Italy, where they really couldn't care less about Trump and Biden in many ways, in a good way. So I'm excited about that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, as you know, I've renamed my podcast Mere Tradition. Kennedy Report ran its course. I'm not really a breaking news kind of guy as much anymore, so this is more in line with what I want to do. So thank you for listening to Mere Tradition, and I will see you next time. And Matt, thanks for coming on.
God bless. Thanks.
Talk to you soon, people.